Hi everybody, I'm Mike, I'm an alcoholic. One time I got introduced as an expert. Yeah, the whole room fell out. I felt sorry for the person who introduced me. They didn't get it. It's like, no. I'm just a history guy. There's some people in this room that know way more about AA history than I do. There's also some significant sobriety in this room. So my hope for you, there's a lot of people not going to learn a thing tonight. You already know all this stuff. And my hope for you is that you simply just enjoy the presentation. And for the newer folks who maybe you just haven't really thought that much about where we came from and how did all this happen, I hope this will just spark a little interest in you. There's lots of resources out there today that can help you get acquainted with our story. I want to thank Jimmy and the Jersey Shore Roundup for inviting me to share my love of our story, AA story, with you people here today. And I'd like to thank Lee for his help for setting this up. Come on, miss, give it up for Lee. I mean, look at this. Is that crazy? God, make me feel like I'm somebody. Anyway, it's really good to be here. So I've got some news for you. And normally this presentation takes about 1 hour and 45 minutes. Oh, but no, don't worry. I've slimmed it down a little bit. So we're going to end right around 7. And don't worry, Bill and Bob are going to meet, and we all get to live. It's going to be okay. My sobriety date is February 24th, 1978, and I was told if I never forgot that date, I'd never have to memorize another one. I'm not testing that theory. I'm just, so far that has been true, and that is fine with me. I had a great career going at the car wash at the time. And no offense, it's an honorable living. Anybody working at a car wash, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. It's a quick 10th step. And when I wasn't sleeping in the woods next to the car wash, I was sleeping on the floor of a cockroach-infested room with a couple of other drunks in beautiful Langley Park, Maryland, which is just right on the D.C. line. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Go Nats! Shh. And I reached out for help, and the hand of AA was there. The hand of AA was there. AA showed up driving an old Chevrolet with a man named Dan O. behind the wheel. A man who would become my sponsor and remain my sponsor for over 30 years until he passed away in 2009. And Dan gets out of the car and he approaches my building and he opens up the door to the hallway and he's hit with the stench of urine, some stale booze, and some wacky weed floating around the hallway. And he climbs some dirty stairs and he knocks on a brown dented up metal door. And when I opened up that door, he stuck his hand out and he said, "Hi, I'm Dan, I'm an alcoholic." Now, I'm not one of these people that was the last to know. I knew what I was. I had hair in those days with usually leaves in it. And so I never had a problem saying I was an alcoholic. And I catch on really quick. Now, I hadn't had a drink that day, and I'm like this, and I stuck my hand out, and I said, "Hi, I'm Mike. I'm an alcoholic." The instant that our hands touched, I became part of a chain reaction that started in Akron, Ohio in 1935 when two drunks discovered they could do together what they could not do by themselves. The real short history lesson is those two went looking for a third one, them three went looking for a fourth one, and here we are today, over 8 decades later, with millions upon millions of recoveries around the world doing good AA, just like they were way back then. We all know why we're here tonight, don't we? We know why we're here. AA always has been and always will be, one drunk helping another one. And whether we say it or not, when we look into each other's eyes, we know something, don't we? We know something. We know that we need each other. We need each other. So there's some good history folks here tonight, and I was going to give them permission, but it seemed I didn't have to. They told me what would happen if I say something that is not accurate. They said they would throw something at me. So I know we got Ohio in the house. We got people that know some stuff. We got Dr. Silkworth's only, 4 or 5 miles from here, so I better get this right. One thing about AA history is there's a lot of AA urban legend out there. I would encourage you to always know the source. Know the source. And anybody that's into AA history will never be offended if you come up to them and say, "Where did you learn that?" They won't take that as, "Are you challenging my veracity?" No, we do that. We do because we want to know, because what we're after is the truth. A lot of good stories out there, except they're just not true. So we try to tell the truth. So the presentation I've put together, I've been doing for a while now, is it's just called Founding Moments. I'm not the only AA history guy in AA that does a Founding Moments presentation. It's more pre-AA history. It's the things that happened, critical events that absolutely had to happen or this room's empty tonight. Now, anybody that knows even a little bit about AA history knows that there's dozens and dozens of things that absolutely had to happen or this room's empty tonight. Well, it might not be empty, but it wouldn't be us in here. It'd be somebody else, maybe a Kiwanis Club or something, I have no idea. But it wouldn't be us. So we can't talk about dozens and dozens So we're going to focus on what most people consider the most important four. So the first one is the interaction between the great Dr. Carl Jung and Roland H. He's a certain businessman in the big book. Evie's visit to Bill, Bill's spiritual experience, and Bill and Dr. Bob meet. Ta-da! And spoiler alert, after Bill and Dr. Bob meet, don't go running out of the room. I just fast forward to Dr. Bob's last talk for just a minute or two. When I get there, we're getting close. So most of us are familiar with our two main characters here. We always hear about how different they were. People have this idea of Bill being this slick-talking New Yorker, an idea-a-minute kind of guy, you know, some maybe kind of not all, you know, kind of up to something. And they think of Dr. Bob as that stern Midwesterner. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Slow your roll there, Billy. And the fact is, and there's some truth to both of that, by the way, and it's a divine mixture of personalities. My just opinion there. But the fact is they're both from Vermont. And also Dr. Bob, you can't see the date, might be cut off there, but Dr. Bob was about 15 years older than Bill. About 15 years older. And they had a lot more in common than people think. They both loved the outdoors. They were both fairly athletic. Bill was a baseball player, and Dr. Bob was an exceptionally good swimmer. So they had a lot in common. Bill was born in East Dorset, Vermont. His people worked the marble quarries of the Green Mountains and owned a tavern and a hotel. So fittingly, Bill was born in a room behind a bar. Most of us know that. Bill's father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family at a very young age. This affected Bill very deeply. And we know a lot about Bill because he just lived longer and he did so much writing. And we know about his less than and, you know, never feeling like he was good enough and all that kind of stuff. And that plagued him for his whole life, really. And he would go on to join the service, and that's where he would start drinking, and he would become a raging alcoholic and destined to be a co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dr. Bob was born up in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, a beautiful drive between East Dorset and St. Johnsbury. I like to say I went up there doing research because it makes me sound smarter, but I was just up there visiting, and it was really cool. You hear about Dr. Bob's house all the time. Of course, you're thinking of 855 Ardmore, the one in Akron, but there's the house that he was born in St. Johnsbury. I don't think they have the resources that the one in Akron does, but, you know, they do the best they can, and it's actually an IOP. It's great. I was out in the parking lot taking pictures of it, and they said, "Hey, you want to lead the meeting?" I said, "Yes, I do. Yes, I do." And I had been at Bill's house to a big book meeting the night before, so that was like an awesome little 24 hours for me. But his father was a judge in Caledonia County. I understand that there's still a portrait of him in the courthouse. They wouldn't let me in with my camera, but I'm over it, so I can't verify that. He had a much older foster sister that we don't know much about, other than that he was fond of her, but she was so much older she was basically out of the house when he was growing up. So he was like an only child. He had a very strict mother. He was forced to go to church. We know from reading Dr. Bob's story in the big book that he was forced to go to church and he really hated it. And he made a vow that as soon as he was out from under parental supervision, he would never darken the doors of another church again. That's a vow he kept for 40 years, by the way. And he was also, he saved, in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, they say he saved a girl's life swimming because he was a lifeguard, I guess, during the summers. And they don't really elaborate on it. So he worked at jobs during the summer in Adirondacks to make money to get through college. And of course, we know from his story how he struggled barely to, he almost didn't get through school because of his drinking. And he went on to become a raging alcoholic and destined to be a co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's just a little thumbnail sketch of our two principal characters here. So we'll get right into it. Founding moment number one. This is the interaction between Dr. Carl Jung. Oh, and by the way, it's Jung. I learned that the hard way. I was at some history place one time, and I said Carl Jung, and they said it's Jung. I said, well, okay, Jung, come on, man, have a sense of humor. It's a Jung. Oh, okay, so I got it. So the interaction between Carl Jung and a really bad drunk named Roland H. in Zurich, Switzerland. Now, Roland was born in Peacedale, Rhode Island. He's a Yale graduate. He comes from a large family, a family of wealth and power. He's a hard worker, smart guy, and a raging alcoholic. Dr. Jung, there's not a whole lot I can say about him that you probably don't already know. He's one of those iconic figures of modern psychology. He's just a big deal, very big deal. His father was a minister, as were 8 of his uncles, and that's important. So we know from reading the big book that Roland went to Dr. Jung and, asked for help, was under his care for about a year. Okay, doc, I got this. Out the door he goes. He's drunk in no time at all. Back to the good doctor he goes, tail between his legs. He says, what's the matter with me? What's the matter with me? I love in there where it says, give it to me, doc. Tell me straight. And it says, and he did. He told him, and this is powerful language, he told him, you're hopeless. You're a chronic alcoholic. I have never, ever seen one single person recover that suffers from this thing to the extent that you do. And of course, Roland felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him. Now, once again, if Roland had just taken the bad news and said, okay, doc, thanks, slumped his shoulders, and this room's empty tonight. This room's empty tonight. But he asked a question, and we're also very glad he did. He says, is there no exceptions? Thank you, Roland, for asking that question. You just saved millions and billions of lives. And Dr. Jung goes on to explain that since early times, and that's important, AA didn't invent this notion that the alcoholic is not just mentally and physically sick, but spiritually sick. That's been around for, in recorded history in the 1700s, there were alcoholics that were recovering by spiritual means. Not to get too far off track, but in the mid-1800s when the temperance movement got wound up, it was like, oh, no, they're not spiritually sick. The temperance movement was rough, man, because they gave up on us. Their whole, if we were drunk, it was like what Bill used to call a self-correcting problem. We was going to get taken care of. Their thing was go after them before they ever take a drink. So Dr. Jung explains to Roland that over the course of history, there have been times, rare as they are, where chronic alcoholics that appear to be hopeless, such as him, do recover by spiritual means. And so Roland says to Dr. Jung, he says, well, I go to church. And Dr. Jung, being a brilliant man, states the obvious. He says, well, it's not enough. You're drunk. And it's often misstated that Dr. Jung directed Roland to the Oxford group. That's not true. He didn't direct him anywhere. He just said, you got to find a spiritual experience. It ain't working for you at church, so that's all I got for you. So first stop for Roland was a place called the Emmanuel Movement in Boston, which was, from everything I've read, was one of the closest thing to Alcoholics Anonymous that I've ever read about. But it just wasn't growing. It just wasn't growing. It wasn't expanding. It was just too small. And Roland spent a lot of time in New York City. So he wound up hooking up with the Oxford group. I'm just going to talk, I say this every time, so I'm just going to talk about the Oxford group for a minute. I really mean it this time. There's plenty of experts on the Oxford group, can tell you anything you want to know about it. My interest in the Oxford group ends with what their influence on Alcoholics Anonymous was. We left the Oxford group for a reason, and there were some good reasons. We owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid to the Oxford group. Bill Wilson said as much himself, and he would always single out Sam Shoemaker. That the principles of our recovery, the foundation, the core of our whole program of recovery came from the Oxford group and nowhere else, especially Sam Shoemaker. Frank Buchman, that's another name, so don't say Buckman. Oh no, that's like a Jung thing, man. It's Buchman. So I was getting smarter by then. I said, okay, Buchman, I got it. I wasn't going to say Buchman, come on. Them history people, they're serious. So he was born in Pennsylvania, Lutheran. He was a Lutheran minister. He did a lot of work in Philadelphia. He had a major falling out with the church over a project that he was passionate about that he couldn't get funding for. And he basically walked away from the church. This is the early 1900s. And he finds himself filled with a lot of resentment and anger against the church administrators that pulled the financing for his pet project that he was very passionate about. He winds up in England at a thing called the Keswick Convention, which was an annual convention of evangelical Christians where they would do what a convention of evangelical Christians would do, exactly what you would think they do. He heard a talk by a woman named Jessie Penn Lewis called The Power of the Cross that changed his life. He had a spiritual experience right there in the hall, and he knew resentment was killing him. He knew he had to forgive those church administrators, and he also just felt a calling. He felt that the problems in the world was that the world was spiritually sick, not something I disagree with. So, we just try to help another alcoholic. Frank was out to convert the world. And it's often said that the Oxford group was only interested in the up and out, and that's not really true. It was a strategy that Frank had. If you could get to the people that were in a position of power and wealth, you could cast a much wider net, convert them. And then his other thing was go to where the future leaders are. The Oxford group had nothing to do with Oxford University. In fact, they were originally called the First Century Christian Fellowship. I'll go through the names in a second here. The Oxford group name kept on after a group of Oxford students who were members of the First Century Christian Fellowship were in South Africa fighting racism, and the local press followed them around and just started calling them the Oxford group, and it stuck. Sam Shoemaker, Baltimore's very own. By the way, there's an AA meeting at the church where Sam is buried. It's very awesome to go there and experience that. I always pay my respects to Sam before I go in for the meeting. He was born in Baltimore. He was about 15, 16 years younger than Frank. They were both in China at the same time doing a lot of work, and at the time Sam was getting the blues from his church. He was Episcopalian, and he was getting the blues from his church about not moving fast enough. He was trying to start YMCAs, and what better person to run into than Frank Buchman. Some people consider Sam a co-founder of the Oxford Group. I leave it to you Oxford Group experts to figure that one out. But in time, Sam would become the de facto head of U.S. operations, and he and Frank would have a split later. So originally they were called the First Century Christian Fellowship, and they became known as the Oxford Group for the reason I just explained. Then for other reasons, they decided to change their name to Moral Rearmament. And then in 2001, they became Initiatives of Change. People are sometimes surprised to hear they're still around. Yes, they are. Just Google Initiatives of Change, and you will see them. So this is where Roland got his spiritual experience, and he was staying sober. And the big book says this was the early 1930s. I'm not going to argue with them. That's what they said. That's when it was. Founding moment number 2, Ebby's visit to Bill. Brooklyn, New York. All right, we got a lot going on here. Roland, we've already been introduced to you. These other 3 men were about 10, 15 years younger than Roland was. They were like annoyances to him, I suppose. Shep was a non-alcoholic, Sebra was an alcoholic, and Ebby, most of us are familiar with. He was most definitely an alcoholic. The thing that these men all had in common is they came from wealthy, powerful families. The other thing they had in common was they all had summer homes in Manchester, Vermont. So for those of you that are familiar with your Vermont geography, which I know everyone is, East Dorset, Vermont is just a stone's throw from Manchester. So here's how Bill and Ebby met. I'll say this right up front. Some of the stories of Bill and Ebby's drinking escapades and their friendship are somewhat exaggerated, but they were friends, and they definitely got some stories to tell. I'll put it that way. Bill didn't like these people. He called them the summer people. You know, he always felt like they were looking down on him. You know, his clothes never fit right, and he didn't talk right, and he didn't have, you know, he didn't want nothing to do with these people. And he would disdainfully refer to them as the summer people. Well, Bill was struggling in school. His mother had moved to Boston to go to school, and he was being raised by his maternal grandparents, who loved Bill very much, and he appreciated that, but they weren't his parents, and Bill just suffered a lot, and he wasn't doing well in school. So they thought, well, this Burr & Burton Academy, it was actually called Burr & Burton Seminary then, was a kind of a hoity-toity private school where a lot of rich kids from out of town went. Hardly any of the locals went there. But they thought it might be good for Bill to send him there. So he went, and that's where he met Ebby. And Ebby was different from the other summer people. Everything I've ever read about Ebby, he must have been like one of the most likable guys in the world. And we owe him so much, and he doesn't get talked about him much, because once again, this room would be empty if it wasn't for Ebby. He struggled with his own drink, and he would die with 2.5 years of sobriety, and we can't measure the gift that he gave us by carrying the message to Bill. But Bill and Ebby, they both loved baseball, so they're all right by me. Bill was a pitcher. I don't know what position Ebby played. And they just bonded. They just really, really liked each other. Ebby was from Albany. He went back to Albany. Bill continued his education and eventually would join his service, where he would start drinking, and we know the rest of that story. And Ebby at some point would start drinking. Neither one of them were drinking in high school, by the way. So this is where they met. Now, Ebby's family lost a ton of money during the stock market crash, and then there were some deaths, and things just weren't the same. And Ebby had always been a bit of a problem child. His family was into politics. His father was mayor of Albany at one time. He had a brother that was mayor of Albany, and he was just kind of like, dude, we can't have this behavior around here. So he was spending more than just summers in Manchester. By this time, the money's pretty shaky at this point. He spent it up, so he is basically in Manchester full time. And so in Vermont, they have this sort of like a 3 strikes and you're out thing with alcohol. You know, on your 3rd violation, alcohol-related violation, you're going to the nut house or the jailhouse 1. You're going somewhere for 6 months. You're going to get locked up. And this story here is Ebby, and I always thought this was a urban legend. Even though it was in our literature, I thought, yeah, that just doesn't sound right. Well, a friend of mine found this newspaper article. It's true. So one of Ebby's alcohol-related infractions was he drove his car into a house. Yeah, and then supposedly, and this was, I said, no, this did not happen. Supposedly this startled woman is just standing there in the kitchen. His car's halfway in there, and he asked for a cup of coffee. It's true, there it is. I don't know what the other one was, but the third one, the one that got him in the jackpot was, this is the Thatcher summer home, and he'd been living there more than just summers, and the place needed some painting, so he paints it, and I don't know, I'm not a painter, but I'm told it's really, really hard to paint without being drunk. So he paints the place, and then it started raining. He's not happy about that, and he's out in the front yard watching the rain messing up his work, and then some birds come by, and they do what birds do, and that messed his work up even a little more. And this is the keen alcoholic mind kicking in here. He goes in the house, gets a shotgun, comes out, and he starts blasting away at these birds. Of course, what he's doing is he's blasting up the front of his house, and it was wet, and he slips. He's sitting on the grass holding a shotgun in his hand, and so they called the police. That's what they did. And he got locked up, and they actually let him go home over the weekend, and they said, well, don't drink. You come back Monday morning, and you come back here sober. And probably one of the first miracles, well, that's really hard to say, but anyway, a really important thing that was just kind of that happened was Ebby had some booze left at the house, and when he got out of jail and went back home, he really, really wanted a drink. I mean, you need one after a day like that, right? And but he didn't drink. He didn't drink. In fact, he got it out of the house. He took it to a neighbor. So come Monday morning, oh, by the way, he was going to go to the Brattleboro Asylum, and I visited there doing my what? My research. And I thought, you know, if it's a hospital, it's a big, brand new, modern place. I'm thinking it's going to be condominiums or a shopping mall or something. It's exactly the same. I mean, I took the picture at the top, and the bottom picture, of course, is a very old picture. Well, there is one difference. It's not the Brattleboro Asylum anymore. It's the Brattleboro Retreat. And I drive in there, I'm driving around, I got my little camera out, I'm taking pictures, I'm waiting for security to roll up on me. They never did. I must have looked like I belonged, I guess. And much to my delight, there was an AA meeting. I went back there, and I couldn't understand. It's in this dingy basement, you know, the bare light bulbs and all that, and there's all these psych patients falling off their chairs, and I couldn't understand why they weren't as excited as I was about being here. You know you're into AA history when you get excited about going to a place where Ebby almost got sent to, because he never got sent there. All right, so we got these 3 guys again, and these 3 guys were in the Oxford group at this point. Like I said, Shep's not really a drunk, but Seaver definitely is. And they had tried to make a project out of Ebby before, and Ebby just was not receptive, shall we say. But you know how it is when you get in a little bit of trouble, you get a little more receptive. And if you're going to go in front of a judge Monday morning for shooting up the front of the house, it's a really, really good idea if a friend of yours is the judge's father. And so they asked Judge Graves, just turn him over to us. I think Roland probably was behind this because he was really the only adult in the room, aside from the judge, of course. So they did. They paroled Ebby to Roland. They stayed briefly in Vermont for a little bit, and then off to New York goes Ebby, and he winds up in a place called the Calvary Mission, which was attached to the Calvary Church. And this is where Ebby was living, and he's, you know, trying to carry whatever message he could. He didn't really know what he was doing, but he's sober, he's not drinking, and he's in this mission. And the mission was run by, of course, none other than our very own Sam Shoemaker, who by this point in time, this is late summer 1934, late summer 1934, and by this time Sam is the, you know, de facto head of Oxford Group U.S. operations. And Sam felt very strongly that the church had a social responsibility to the down and out, and to feed the hungry and house the homeless, and what a concept. And so this chapel was not being used when he took over that church, and so he made it a mission, which was really, really great, and we're so glad he did. So Ebby's there, and he's just kind of doing his thing. Now it's November 1934. Bill has made a fortune and lost it twice. He's, out of the service, had his little war experience, and he's made a fortune and lost it twice. His drinking is so out of control. The house you see on the right was the house that his wife, Lois Burnham, he married. She was one of the summer people, but he fell in love with her, so they got married. And this was the house she was born in, and Bill and her parents all lived there. It was a very happy home at one time until Bill's drinking got really out of hand. And when Lois's mother died, Bill was so drunk he didn't even show up to the funeral. That didn't go over very well. And her father left in disgust, and that family suffered a lot because of the stock market crash too. And the only reason they weren't foreclosed on is there was a moratorium on foreclosures. Bill's drinking had progressed to a point where they had dragged a mattress downstairs because they were afraid he would either fall out or jump out of one of the upper story windows. He would shake so badly he couldn't shave. He would routinely lose all control of his bodily functions. And in the morning when Lois would be getting ready to go to work, he would pretend like he was still asleep because he was filled with so much shame. He just couldn't look at her. And then as soon as she would leave the house, he would start scrounging around the house looking for something to drink. This is the condition our co-founder was in when Ebby makes the call to him. So Ebby's thinking about his old buddy here, and he says, I'm going to go pay him a visit. He calls him on the phone. This is late November 1934. Bill thinks they're going to get drunk together, but something else happened. Now, I have all the respect in the world for AA's official birth date of June 10th, 1935, but there's a part of me that really feels like Alcoholics Anonymous was born here at this kitchen table, which, for those of you that don't know, this kitchen table is now at Stepping Stones, the home of Bill and Lois, and it's the same table that was in the place in Brooklyn. This is the table that Bill and Ebby sat at. And it's just an incredible feeling sitting there. And if you haven't done it, please do. Please do. It's not that far. It's a fun day. There's good people up there. So I'm going to go ahead and let Bill explain what happened that day, if he cooperates.
So I had known this being sober in New York for years. I said to him, what about a drink, Evan? No, he said, I'm not drinking. Said, do you want a water item? No, I'm just not drinking today. I said, what's got into you, my friend? And looking at me, he said simply and smilingly, I've got religion. I was dying and thought that was. Well, I had to be polite. I said, what brand of religion have you got? He said, I wouldn't call it a religion at all. The religion of common sense, perhaps. I met up with a group of people, and I drew from them certain essential ideas about a way of life that did the job for me. And here is what I did. I got honest with myself as never before. I talked over my personality defects with another than common. I visited the people I had harmed and made restitution, thereby sweeping away the debris of the sin. And he said, Bill, I know you're a very skeptical one. This may die. But I found that I couldn't make that simple program of living work until I asked God, as I understood God, to help.
Well, anybody that knows Bill's story knows that this was one heck of a revelation. Bill wasn't too cool on his whole God thing. But Ebby and Bill didn't have to go through the identification process because they drank together. And there's something that you just cannot deny. Bill was drunk. Ebby was sober. He makes the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. Bill was never the same after that. He would later say in every waking moment he couldn't get Ebby's face out of his mind and he couldn't get his words out of his mind. They just tortured him for the next 3 weeks. For the next 3 weeks. Probably, I guess, we didn't have AA yet, but it was probably the first case of a belly full of booze and a head full of AA. Bill just wasn't right after that. So he goes up to the mission. He's, let me check this place out. He goes up to the rail, witnesses and all that kind of stuff, and then, well, okay, maybe this thing will work, because once again, he's sober, I'm not, kind of tough to argue with that. So a quick detox is in order. So we're going to shoot forward to Bill's spiritual experience. This is number 3. That's Towns Hospital. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide just to say Charles Towns is a fascinating character. He was not a doctor. Where he came up on such a effective detox regime is unknown. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip right through here. He was running a hospital in New York, and some people who did have some credentials took an interest in his work, and that's why he was getting a little more accepted. Dr. Silkworth, who we all know and is buried not far from here, if you are a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, you can say thank you right now. We owe our lives to this man. He was one of the most compassionate men on the planet. Everybody that met him said the same thing. They said you knew you were in the presence of somebody who was not judging you. You were in the presence of somebody very special who wanted nothing but to help you any way he could. It was as if all of the light in the room would gather in his face, and you knew he was listening to you with his heart. And that's Dr. Silkworth. And I could talk about him a lot longer, but I better not. So Bill goes rolling up to Towns Hospital here. He's got a bottle of beer in his hand, fiddling enough, and he says, "Doc, I found the answer. I found the answer." And of course, this just broke Dr. Silkworth's heart. Bill had been there a couple of times before. His brother-in-law was a physician and had turned him on to this place. And this just broke Dr. Silkworth's heart. And Dr. Silkworth just put his arm around him and said, "I'm sure you have, my boy. Now let's get you upstairs." And Bill just bowed his head, and up he goes like an errant child. So he's there for a few days. This is December of 1934. He's there for a few days. He's through the most brutal part of the detox regime. All the medication is out of him. Now it's just a matter of regaining some strength, and something happened. And we'll let Bill explain it.
Regarding the little cell, I sunk into a deeper and deeper depression. And in the bottom of that pit, I suppose the last trace of my obstinacy was crushed out. I was, in fact, a child crying in the dark. And I said, as you have said, now I will do anything to get well. And then, with no hope, no faith to call, I cried out, if there is a God, will be shown to us. My experience was granted to me very suddenly. It seemed to me that place lit up in a great point of light. In the mind's eye, I seem to be on a mountaintop. A great wind is blowing, and I know it is not of air, but of spirit. There are no words to describe those minutes.
So, you just go through this brutal detox. You've been hit with this message that Ebby brought you. You ain't been right for a long time, but you certainly ain't been right the last 3 weeks. And now you got white lights, you got the wind not of air, but of grace on a mountaintop, got other preachers and all that. And Bill got scared. He said, "Man, I finally lost it. I have finally lost it." So he did a very smart thing. He calls Dr. Silkworth in. And how easy it would have been for a weary Dr. Silkworth to either not see him at all or just go in, "Nurse, give him something." But he didn't. Dr. Silkworth came in and he listened, and Bill explained everything that just happened to him. And then he springs the million-dollar question on him. He says, "Have I lost my mind? Am I mad?" And Dr. Silkworth says, "No, my boy, you're perfectly sane." He says, "You're perfectly sane. I'm just a simple man of science. I don't understand such things, but something has happened to you, and it's real." And then the line that most of us know, he says, "And whatever it was, you'd better hang on to it. It was so much better than what you had just a while ago." Lois remembers, said that she knew something was very different about Bill, and that she felt like he'd been relieved of his obsession. All right. Oh man, we better get meeting. Bill and Bob better meet here, right? I mean, come on now. Let's move along here. We got a lot going on here. That's Dr. Bob's house in the upper left-hand corner. Dr. Bob, of course, in the right. In the lower left is the house of T. Henry and Clarice Williams. That's an important house we'll talk about in a second. And the middle house is called the Gate House or the Gate Lodge on the estate. It was the the groundskeeper superintendents where they live in quarters. Frank Seiberling was the founder of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, and his son married a woman named Henrietta Seiberling. We'll talk about her in just a second here, but that's a very important house. That's the point I'm making. All right, we got Edison, we got Ford, we got Firestone. What do these guys have to do with the founding of AA? Well, I'm going to shorten this up a lot. There was a young guy, his name was Jim Newton, and he was a real go-getter, not an alcoholic, but a real go-getter. When he was a very smart guy from Philadelphia, as a matter of fact, and in the summertime when he was in college, he would sell luggage up and down the East Coast, and he just had kind of normal stuff going on. You know, it's hard for us to understand it, but normal people kind of get anxiety and don't know what they're doing with their life. We just get it to like the 10th power, and we've got to find a solution. But, you know, it happens to normal people, too. So he had some of that. And he's up in a small town called Winchton, Massachusetts. And he's looking for, his day's work is done, and he's looking for a little excitement. Maybe do a little drinking. He's not one of us, but maybe do a little drinking, do a little dancing, maybe get lucky, whatever. So he sees these, this would be like stalking today, by the way, but, you know, he sees two attractive women heading towards a bar. So he says, well, they must know where the party is. I'm going to follow them. So he follows them into this bar. It's called the Toy Town Tavern, and they you know, the bar's to the right, and he's thinking that's where they're going to go, but they go to the left. So he goes left. Well, you got to follow him, see where it must be a private party. And he walks smack dab into the middle of an Oxford group meeting. Man, talk about a buzzkill. You know, you think you do a little drinking, a little dancing, maybe get lucky, and whoa! So what do? He can't leave, so he sits down. Long story short, he is just captivated by the Oxford group message. He just becomes an ardent Oxford group member. What I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes is how the Oxford group gets to Akron, because with no Oxford group in Akron, we ain't sitting here today. So that's what all this is about. Mr. Firestone really saw something in Jim. Jim was a real go-getter because he had bought some land. He's not even old enough to sign the documents yet. He's only like 20 years old. He had to get his father to sign for the documents, but it was his money. Anybody that's familiar with Fort Myers, Florida, you know, Edison Park, you got Edison this, Edison that. Well, there's your guy. Jim Newton was a guy who developed all that. And one of the, I think it was Mrs. Edison, had a little problem with an aspect of the development, and he went and spoke with her, and he became especially close with those two families. And Firestone had a place in Miami, but he visited frequently over there, and Harvey Firestone saw something in Jim that he wanted him to come work for him. He really wanted him to come work for him bad. So Jim finally says yes. So they get up to Akron, and Mr. Firestone had a son. His nickname was Bud. He was a little bit older than Jim, but not a lot. Bud had a little problem. Anybody care to guess what that was? Yeah, he was one of us. He was one of us, and as been so eloquently stated earlier in this conference, what the alcoholic does to the people that love him. His father was just dying watching his son go down the tubes, and there was nothing he could do about it. So he asked Jim, he says, is there anything you can do to help him? Jim, man, much to his credit, he says, well, I don't know. I mean, I can try. So he'd go to like exercise farms with him and drying out joints. He did everything to try to get him sober, and it's just nothing's working. And he knew there was going to be an Episcopal Bishops Conference in Denver, and there was going to be a large Oxford group presence there. So he asked Mr. Firestone if he could take Bud, and Mr. Firestone says, yeah, please do. So they go. And once again, long story short, I say that a lot, and it's a lie, by the way. Bud is captivated by the Oxford group message. You know, Jim was literally feeding him teaspoons of whiskey on the train on the way down there. But they stay there for a few days. You know, Bud is all good. On the way back to Akron, Jim astutely steers Bud to the private rail car of none other than Sam Shoemaker. And the predecessor to our third step is that's where Bud made his surrender. So they get back to Akron. And Mr. Firestone is so grateful, just so grateful about what's happened. He wants to do something to pay back the Oxford group. It's important to note he underwrote this. He didn't actually bankroll it, but what he did was he proposed sort of like an Oxford group conference at the Mayflower Hotel, no less. And it didn't happen right away, but in 1933 approximately it did happen. And this is where I try to get artsy. Feel free to ooh and ah. It was in all the papers. Oh, come on. Help a brother out. Okay, boy, a rough crowd, let me tell you. Anyway, so now the Oxford group is in Akron. It's in Akron. And they left some people behind to help them start some of their own meetings. There was a meeting in the West Hill section of Akron on a Thursday night, and there were some very important attendees there, important to us. There was our beloved Dr. Bob and his wonderful, wonderful wife, Annie, and a woman named Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta Seiberling was born in Kentucky. She was raised in Texas, the daughter of a judge. I'm telling you, she wore her feelings on her sleeve. This was not somebody you had to wonder where she was coming from. You knew where she was coming from. She was crazy smart. She graduated from Vassar College when she was 15 years old with a major in music and a minor in psychology. And so they're at this Thursday night Oxford group meeting one night, and a woman named Delphine Weber comes up to Henrietta afterwards. Now, we don't know much about her. I think her husband had something to do with the school board there. But really, in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, it doesn't talk a lot about how would she know this, who is she. Henrietta had been a patient of Dr. Bob, so she knew Dr. Bob pretty well. They were pretty close, but she didn't know him well enough to know about his drinking. So this woman, Delphine, comes up to Henrietta after that Thursday night meeting, and she says, "What are we going to do about Dr. Bob?" By the way, Dr. Bob was Dr. Bob before AA, just so you'll know. Am I right, Kent? Am I right about? Okay, good. All right. He's going to keep me straight. If I get any of these Ohio things wrong, he's going to throw something at me. So she said, "What are we going to do about Dr. Bob?" And Henrietta said, "Well, what do you mean, what are we going to do about it?" She said, "Well, he's a drunk. He's going to lose everything. He's about to lose his practice. He's going to lose his home. What are we going to do about him?" You can't present Henrietta's probably eligible for a couple other programs, I think. You know, Gail jokes that this was the first intervention because she had to act. We got to do something. One of her, I won't call it a complaint, but one of the things that she wished the Oxford group did that they weren't doing at least then was their sharing was kind of superficial at their meetings. She wanted to dig down, get deep. So I have a feeling she didn't ask T. Henry and Clarice if we could have a meeting at your house on Wednesday nights, which, by the way, this is the predecessor to AA Group Number 1. The King School Group still meets on, Kent's nodding, I'm okay, still meets on Wednesday nights. And the idea was to have a smaller meeting and to get these people to draw out and talk more deeply about themselves. And the hope was that Dr. Bob would talk about his drinking. So this is just a short snippet of Henrietta explaining the plan. She was interviewed by her son on the phone. He was standing in for her for a Founders Day once, and he just wanted to make sure he was getting the facts right. So this is just a short little blurb.
And so we did all share very deeply our shortcomings and what we had victory over. And then it was started, as I waited, and I thought, will Bob say this? And sure enough, he said, "Well, it is serious illness. And you good people have shared things that I feel very costly to you. And I will tell you something that may cost me, I think, may cost me my faith. And he said, I'm a silent drinker. And I can't stop.
She would go on to ask if we wanted to pray about it, and everybody in the room did pray. Bill's not there yet, so they prayed that there would be some sort of solution for Dr. Bob's drinking. Henrietta thought she had it after she received her guidance, and she calls Dr. Bob on the phone one day and says, "You must never, ever touch another drop of alcohol." You know, that was her guidance. And Dr. Bob says, "You know, do you believe that I really want to stop drinking?" She said, "Of course, I know you do." He says, "I really do. I just don't understand it." And then he said something very important. He says, "Nobody understands it." But that was about to change. Meanwhile, back in New York, Bill had been hearing little whispers from Lois's family like, "We're really glad that Bill is sober. But do you think he's ever going to get a job?" Yeah, and this kind of hurt his feelings. So he goes sniffing around Wall Street. He finds something that's right up his alley. It was a proxy fight in Akron. So he goes out there, and the proxy fight should have been a slam dunk, but it just wasn't. And it turns out the other side did some really questionable stuff. And so Bill was filled with, oh man, he's starting to get angry. And for the first time in 4.5, 5 months, he's tempted to drink. He's in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. And it's amazing to me, 19 years before I was born, in the span of about 60 seconds or so, events happened in that lobby and in Bill's mind and in his heart that saved my life and millions upon millions of others. I'm thinking there's some divinity going on here. We know from reading Bill's story that he was hearing all the noise in the bar and he drifts over there. Well, maybe I could have a ginger ale. Ooh, that won't work. Well, maybe I could have just a couple. He knew he was in trouble. He knew he was in trouble. So Bill's going to explain a little bit about this realization that he is in trouble. He wants a drink and he's afraid he's going to get drunk.
And I thought to myself, now I need an alcoholic just as bad as he could possibly need me. I'm in danger of getting drunk. I must find another alcoholic in this town, and right now. I called the preacher. He was a little puzzled that I was not from New York, so would find some drunks to work on. Not one at a time seemed enough to him. But he finally caught on, and through a series of confidential circumstances, I'm face to face with Dr. Bob in the home of a non-alcoholic. One who understood, and one who cared enough. Dr. Bob and Ann had entered that room at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Bob couldn't stay for a minute, but we talked for 5 hours. And this time, there was real mutuality. I told him at once, please stay. I need you as much as you could possibly need me.
Once again, we know why we're here, don't we? We know it. We need each other. And that was the realization that came to him. And Dr. Bob, as people know, he told Ann on the way over there, he says, I'll give this mug 15 minutes. I'm not interested in talking to him or anybody else. So they go in there, they talk for 5 hours. Anybody who has not been up to Akron and seen the historical sites, please do. Please do. I was there just a couple of weeks ago in this library, which is off the living room where Henrietta smartly took Bill and Bob after dinner to sit and talk. And it's the only place on the planet, I've been sober a long time, but I'm still kind of wound up, and it's the only place on the planet where I can sit still. And when you go any other time but Founders Day, everybody should go to Founders Day, it's wonderful to experience, but if you go any other time, you will have the place to yourself. I sat there less than 2 weeks ago for about a half hour, totally undisturbed. And you notice the clock in the corner is at 5 o'clock. I don't know if that's an accident or if somebody did it on purpose, but I know this much. There's this little bald-headed guy with glasses from Maryland that whenever he goes through Akron and stops in there, if it's not 5 o'clock, it somehow becomes 5 o'clock. Just saying. So that's Mother's Day weekend. Why isn't that AA's founding date? Well, we know the story. Something happened. There was a point where Dr. Bob balked just a little bit. I leave it to you to figure that one out. Most of you probably already know it. There's a good clue and a vision for you, what he would not do. I'll do anything but that. Well, he changes his mind. So Dr. Bob's going to explain what happened. I love the way he talks. I had a hooker or two to settle me down. As most of us know, he had. There's a couple of things that are not suggested you do on the day of your last drink. One of them is perform surgery, which Dr. Bob did, and one of them is to go around town making your amends. Dr. Bob did both of these. This is our flying blind period. But you know what? Guy never had another drink, so I ain't going to argue with it. It worked for him. It worked for him. So I'm going to go just a couple of more minutes here, unless Jimmy's going to throw my... I see the exit sign here, so I'm ready, man. You come after me, I'm going. They got some big people around here. But I want to fast forward a little bit so that Bill and Bob meet and we all get to live. Okay, and Bill had moved into the house over that summer, so... That's kind of the story, very much abbreviated, since this is normally about an hour and 45-minute presentation. But that's the story, and I hope you get a good sense of what happened. I want to fast forward 15 years to our first international, 1950. Ann had recently died, and Dr. Bob had been diagnosed with what would be terminal cancer that would take his life. And an AA from New York, Al S., a guy who years later would write the responsibility pledge, drove to Akron and made Dr. Bob as comfortable as possible for the trip up to Cleveland. And they went up there. And this is just a short little excerpt from that talk in Cleveland. And it's important and it's powerful. Dr. Bob was a man of few words, but man, his words counted. His words counted. I don't know. I hear those words and I think, Dr. Bob was supposed to be the tough one. I don't know. Make up your own mind about that. Dr. Bob was an incredible individual. We're in the home stretch now, guys. I promise you. We're almost done. At that international convention in 1950, the traditions were adopted. But Bill had something else on his mind. It was this thing called a conference. There was this thing called an Alcoholic Foundation. It was the predecessor to our Board of Trustees that was essentially running AA's World Services such as they were at the time. The link between the groups, the membership, and this board, who most members didn't even know who all was on it, had always been Bill and Bob. That was the communication. Well, Dr. Bob gets diagnosed with terminal cancer. Bill's not stupid. He knows he ain't going to last forever either. Something has to replace them. And so Bill and some others came up with this conference idea, the one that's in place today. But it was a very contentious idea. In the Akron crowd, Dr. Bob's son once said if it was left up to the folks in Ohio, AA would have never got out of Ohio. And if it was left up to the New York crowd, they'd have put this thing on the New York Stock Exchange. So Bill was the only person in the planet that could draw Dr. Bob out of his comfort zone a little bit. And conversely, Dr. Bob was the only person on the planet that could slow Bill down. Whoa, wait a minute, Billy. No, we don't need to be going there. But I'm sure Dr. Bob didn't quite talk like that. A little license here. So what a divine blend of two personalities. So I know y'all probably seen that one of the many Bill W. movies, but My Name is Bill W., the one from a long time ago with James Garner and James Woods in it. In the beginning of that movie, Dr. Bob's in bed, deathly ill, and can barely speak, and Bill's sitting next to him. And I suppose they did that for dramatic effect, but I think the real story is really more powerful. Dr. Bob was up. He was dressed in a light gray suit, and he and Bill talked for hours that day, for hours. And they walked out onto that porch where you see Bill sitting in front of Dr. Bob's house there. And Dr. Bob finally agreed. He says, but it has to be AA's decision. Because Bill knew this thing ain't going to fly without Dr. Bob's blessing. So Dr. Bob said he would give it his blessing, but he said, Bill, it has to be AA's decision. It can't be ours. So the two men shook hands and they looked into each other's eyes. They were both over 6 feet tall and had these blue eyes, and they knew that they had probably made their last decision together as co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bill walked down those stairs that you see Dr. Bob sitting on, and when he got to the bottom step, Dr. Bob says, "Remember, Bill?" And Bill stopped and turned around and looked at him, and he says, "Let's keep this thing simple. Let's keep this thing simple." Bill was so overcome with emotion, all he could manage was a wink and a smile, maybe a thumbs up, and he knew he was probably looking at his good friend Bob for the last time. And he turned around and he walked away, and in fact, Dr. Bob would die the following Thursday. I'm so grateful that the hand of Providence saw fit to bring these two men together when they did. Could there have been somebody else? Maybe, but we don't know that. And when? When would that have happened? But it was Bill, and it was Bob, and it was Akron, it was 1935. And a fellowship has grown up around the world where millions upon millions of lives have been changed. As we heard this morning, not just the alcoholics, the people who love the alcoholic. I don't know how you can count those numbers of the impact that this thing has had on the planet. It's just absolutely incredible. I owe it to this fellowship to keep that memory alive and to treat history with reverence. One of my favorite AA historians was Ernie Kurtz, and he was asked once, "What about this AA history thing?" And he said, "We need to treat it with reverence." Thank you all for being here.